The approach you take to developing your smart contracts is paramount when it comes to building a DeFi application or any kind of blockchain-based application that uses smart contracts, and especially ones that are going to house real digital assets. And of course, obviously, the first downstream effect of how you develop your smart contracts is the security and the hackability of your smart contracts. When you deploy, are your smart contracts going to get hacked, right? So obviously that's a first order consequence of the quality of your development process. But even downstream of that are third order consequences, such as, how fast are you going to be able to ship your smart contracts, and how much is it going to cost for you to undergo a thorough security process? Developing smart contracts in the right way and taking the right approach can quite literally make a six-figure difference, depending on the protocol, in the security process. And it can make a 7, 8, or 9, or sometimes even 10-figure difference when we're talking about a protocol hack. So the bottom line is, if you're developing a DeFi protocol and you're looking to take a DeFi protocol, or really any kind of smart contract protocol, to market, we need to first take a look at how are we approaching the development of our smart contracts. We need to make sure that we're taking the right approach, we're doing the right things. If we're not, we need to implement those things so that when we actually go to take our protocol through the security process, the security process can be, as swift as we would like it to be, and it can be, within a reasonable budget. It's not something that could be long and arduous because of a few mistakes that we made early on. And then, of course, even moving past the security process, and have a protocol fully deployed that effectively accomplishes the goals of a protocol without any security flaws. So it all comes down to our approach that we take when we're developing our smart contracts. So, of course, in this video, I'm going to be discussing, as promised, when you clicked on the video, I told you there are going to be 9 keys to developing secure smart contracts, and that is exactly what I'm going to give you here today. I'm going to talk about 9 things that I believe have a significant impact on the downstream effects of, how swiftly are we able to get this to market? How swiftly are we able to get this through a security process? How efficiently, in terms of a budget, can we get this through a security process? And then, of course, how can we just not have critical bugs and vulnerabilities when we go into production? So today, let's talk about these 9 key things. What are these 9 things that you can implement into your development process that will help you do all of those things we just talked about? But of course, before we dive into these 9 key things, my name is Owen, and over 2 years ago now, I co-founded Guardian Audits, and ever since then, our team has conducted dozens and dozens and dozens of security reviews. We've seen this stuff up close. We've seen what kind of development best practices yield the best results when you actually do get to the security review phase. And of course, my goal with all of these videos is to document my learnings from the past 2 years of doing security reviews, and I suppose the past 2 years even before that, just developing my own smart contract systems and shipping them and seeing the results of potentially some errant development practices down the road, then giving all that experience to you from, dozens and dozens of security reviews, a couple thousand hours spent auditing smart contracts up close, so that you won't make all the mistakes that I've personally seen, mistakes that I've personally made. Hopefully you can get to launch, get to market faster, more efficiently, and more secure. So with that out of the way, let us dive into these 9 key things that you should be incorporating in your development process. Okay, fantastic. So without further ado, let's just dive right into this. We've got no more fluff to give you. We're going to dive into the first one here, which, to be honest, is obvious. It is terse, but it is also probably, in my opinion, in my experience, the number one lever that you can pull in terms of reducing the amount of critical bugs and vulnerabilities, reducing the amount of time that you have to spend going through the security process, and overall just being able to ship a product much, much faster. And that is to just write less code. So you're thinking, well, obviously, yes, just write less code. But really, this is extremely ignored and not valued enough, in my opinion, especially with some of the code bases that I've seen get shipped and some of the approaches that I've seen been taken. I think that the vast majority of code bases and smart contracts that are actually deployed could be reduced in size probably by 50%. Or potentially even more. And so, of course, first of all, why is it so important that we actually write less code? And then maybe what are a few things that we can do to actually achieve that? So obviously, if we have less code, we're going to have, just in general, less complexity to deal with. And I will say from my experience as a smart contract security researcher, my favorite thing to see is complexity as somebody who's looking for vulnerabilities. That is exactly where I like to dive in and I like to spend a lot of my time focusing on, because always it comes to be that in the most complex parts of a code base, in the parts of a code base that aren't really fully ironed out, they're a little bit verbose and they're very unreadable. Those are the exact parts of the code base where critical bugs lie. So firstly, just on the complexity front, what does this look like? This looks like, doing multiple passes, making things as easily readable as possible. Let's tone down the verbosity. And let's also just, have a step back and think, what is the most simple design to achieve this versus writing any amount of code that just accomplishes the thing, right? There's many ways to accomplish what we want to accomplish with our smart contracts, but the most valuable way to accomplish that is the one that is the least complex, the most readable, the least lines of code. And well, maybe obviously don't go for literally the least lines of code, because that's not going to be as readable. It's going to be more complex. You want to find the good balance of those three things. But overall, in general, I would say that many DeFi protocols, they just have more code than is necessary. And just to give you an idea on, what could be the impact of reducing the code that you have in your smart contract project, let's say even beyond just avoiding a potential critical vulnerability, making it into production, even just talking about directly the audit costs that you're going to have to expend to ship a larger code base are going to be significantly bigger than a smaller one. So for example, let's say you had a 2,000 line, let's say 2,100 lines of Solidity code. We could say this was, normalized Solidity code, where we go and we actually remove like trivial lines and actually like collapse functions and things like this, and obviously remove comments and stuff like that. Now, most audit firms are going to go ahead and quote you on a weekly basis. So they're going to estimate this is how many weeks this project is going to take. And then there's going to be some weekly base fixed amount for the project. And so an average range for what a firm might charge is, anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000. So we'll say this imaginary example firm just charges $25,000 per week. And just as a general rule of thumb you might be able to use is maybe a firm will review 1,000 normalized Solidity lines of code per week. Obviously, it depends on the firm, but this is a rule of thumb that is reasonable across the industry. So if we take our 2,000 normalized Solidity lines of code project, or 2,100 or something like this, that estimate would give us about 2 weeks. So you'd be paying, roughly maybe around $50,000 for this engagement. Now, of course, depending on the circumstances, depending on specifically what that project is, depending on how dense the complexity is, it could be a lot more than that. It could be somewhat less than that. Just to demonstrate how literally reducing lines of code can affect even just this immediate cost, if we were to take back the lines of code to maybe something like 1,500, 1,400, which I believe is entirely achievable for many smart contract systems. They could be, radically simplified, and many lines of code could be removed. This not only literally makes the auditor's job easier, or the security reviewer's job easier, But because of that, they're going to do it faster and they're going to charge you less as a result. So literally, depending on the firm that you're engaging, just as a result of, really simplifying the code base and reducing the lines of code that are actually in the project by something like 30%, they might bring your quote down to a week and a half. Or some firms might only go based on literally whole weeks. So they might go, this is closer to a week, so we're going to charge based on a week. So there is potential for you to go from literally a $50,000 quote to a $25,000 quote or a $37,500 quote or something like this. So that just goes to show that reducing the amount of code that you have in your smart contract can save you, a lot of time going through the security process, a lot of headache, even in continued development, and just be a lot more efficient in terms of budget, timeline, and everything that has to do with getting to a mainnet deployment. That was really, really a lot on just writing less code. Now, obviously, one quick tip that I have for how do we actually implement this, how do we actually write less code, is to start off with your storage variables. Be very, very picky about the storage variables that you use and only use exactly what you need, what you must have, and never be overabundant with the amount of storage variables that you're tracking, and never ever track one actual value with two different storage variables. Maybe they might be tracked in different ways, but we'll get into that in a bit. So that is number one here, is just to write less code in general. And so of course that kind of leads us into number two here, which is to genuinely just spend considerable time thinking about the design before we actually go and implement. So a lot of times, maybe in traditional Web 2.0 software, you think of a way to accomplish something, and perhaps, we just head down that path immediately instead of maybe, sitting back and thinking, no, really, what is the simplest, what is the most approachable way to achieve this, with considerations for things like security, for things like maybe gas optimization or things like this. So really, the second tip, it is in line with, having less code, but it is to stop yourself from just, going straight into implementing, and really take the extra time to fully consider all of the options in terms of design choices that you have laid out in front of you. And this might be frustrating in the beginning because, of course, the development process as a result of this is going to take longer because we are really being very methodical about what we're thinking about in terms of design and approach to building our smart contracts. But I can guarantee you that this extra time spent in the first portion of our development lifecycle here is going to save us an exponential amount of time and money, and potentially even reputational damage if we were able to get into the deployment phase with a critical bug. So trust me, we want to spend the most amount of time thinking about this system up front when we're actually creating it first. And you might end up finding yourself rewriting and redesigning a couple times before you end up with something that you believe is the best approach, that is the most readable, that is the simplest, that has, the least complexity, not using more lines of code than it should. And then all of that extra time spent in the initial phase is going to be absolutely made up for when we get into the security review process. And then we get into, of course, an actual deployment. And so I would say just a couple, things to think about around considering designs is to think about, let's think about all the features that are going to be implemented that we might not have implemented yet. So for example, if you're making a perpetuals exchange or something, you have, you're going to have borrowing fees, you're going to have funding fees, maybe you're going to have price impact or something, depending on your implementation. And then of course you've got to think about those three things and potentially other things, along with liquidations, opening positions, closing positions, decreasing the size of positions, on and on and on. We want to think about all of the features in unison. We want to think about what is the best design that's going to be amenable to all of those things. And then lastly, when you're in this development stage, you should quite often find yourself spending more time developing while you're not actually at your computer than you spend time literally hardcore developing and actually writing it out at your laptop, at your computer. So I'll just leave you with those, few things that I've found to be helpful. But now let's talk about some more atomic, on the ground, line by line. How can we actually literally make our smart contracts more secure in the actual development process when we come to, literally just submit our code for security review? What are some of the things we can do to be protected and be safe from a development aspect? So the first, boots on the ground thing that we can implement is just to specifically only allow the user to interact with the protocol exactly how we expect them to. So what does this mean? What do I mean by this? I mean, if you are accepting an input parameter, we want to always validate that it is within the range that we expect it to be. We never want to allow something like, let's say 0 is not what we consider to be a valid value. Great. Let's validate that and get that out of the potential input set. Because I tell you, you could literally see and be like, oh yeah, but it's fine if they put 0 here. But here's the thing. It's fine if they put 0 here until it isn't, right? And so we want to build up that habit, that discipline of validating the inputs and do it always. Because when it isn't done, this is where sometimes the really niche edge case exploits can come up. And I'll show you a way I like to actually visualize this is, let's say we've got our function here. Now there are many different paths that can be followed depending on the input that we have. So let's just imagine here's a path if the value of an input was 0. Here's the path if the value of an input was 1. And then here's the path that, if it was 2, or if it was the maximum you went, we're just going to say max. Obviously, I'm not going to write that out. And on and on and on, right? So there's different paths, different behaviors that will come as a result. The system will do different things based on the inputs. This is how a program works. So, of course, what we can do is we want to narrow the scope of the potential paths that can actually happen here. We want to bottleneck what can happen into only what we expect. Because here's the thing, if you have, this is just one function. If we have 20, 30 functions across the scope of a system, then one of these little 0 inputs, or, if there's some upper bound of an input or something like that, one of those can cause something interesting that's non-trivial, which could be literally just a knob that might be literally the only thing that an attacker needs to leverage that little unexpected state to cause, rippling effects of, what ultimately will become a catastrophic exploit. So instead of even risking the possibility, as a best practice, what we want to do is we want to just stop those. We want to stop those unexpected states from being able to happen, and we want to cut them off at the root so that they cannot even allow some tiny unexpected thing to happen. So that is number 3 here. We want to only allow the user to interact with the protocol exactly how we expect. So explicitly disallow unexpected inputs, unexpected interactions, etc., etc. Okay, and this one will be somewhat similar. It's kind of the yin to the yang of this number 3 is to handle all cases. Now, I don't mean cases as in the inputs, right? We want to be sufficiently validating and limiting the inputs, but there's going to be cases that come up, especially in complex DeFi protocols, that they're just going to be cases that are in the set of possible edge cases. We need to appropriately handle them or mitigate them as best we can. So a great example of this is insolvent liquidations. So if you have a DeFi protocol that has a liquidation function, which, let's be honest, a lot of DeFi protocols do, then undoubtedly you have at least one mechanism in place, whether it be like an LTV ratio or some kind of maximum leverage threshold for your liquidations to trigger something like this, so that liquidations are solvent, positions are solvent, whatever that position might be, when it gets liquidated. And so there's no bad debt or anything like that accrued to the protocol. Now, in many cases, liquidations are going to happen as expected, but it is possible for a liquidation or an account to become insolvent before it is liquidated. And so we should always expect the unexpected in this case. We should always be designing our smart contracts to, even if things go wrong, we are there to handle it, right? So in this case, when we have an insolvent position, maybe we need to just liquidate whatever is left in the position. We need to have some sort of answer for the bad debt that will be accrued. But the bad answer to this, or the unaddressed case for this, would be, oh, well, the liquidation just reverts because we can't repay all of the debt or something like this. So make sure that you handle all cases, even if they're unexpected cases. We want to expect the unexpected in our smart contracts. And especially as an example, if you have liquidations, you best be sure that insolvent liquidations are still possible and there's an answer for them. Okay, number 5 here is, of course, to avoid for loops where possible. So this is something I see a lot of more junior smart contract developers do, is they use for loops maybe a little bit too liberally. And this usually goes hand in hand with just some higher order design mistakes. So things like pushing tokens to addresses instead of having those addresses pull those tokens to them. But in general, we want to design with the EVM in mind, with the fact that, gas is a consideration, with the fact that also for doing, maybe an external call or sending tokens in a loop, that there are risks with that. But generally, whenever possible, we want to avoid using for loops in our application. And especially, I would also go so far as to say as we should pretty much never have a for loop that loops over an unbounded array, especially if it's an array that's not necessarily controlled by some centralized party. Then there should literally never be a for loop that loops over, like, let's say, a list of users or something like this. That should quite literally, I cannot think of a use case right now where that would be amenable. There needs to be some sort of answer that is, maybe instead of trying to loop over all of the users to, do some kind of weird reward distribution or something like this, let's use a reward per share model, right? Or if it's something separate, let's just track the global value of this thing. Like maybe you need to track open interest for every open position. Well, let's have, the position track its own open interest, and then let's also track in a storage variable the total open interest for longs, for shorts, whatever that may be. And so there's, plenty of design decisions that you can make to avoid using for loops and stuff like this in your smart contract. And this harkens back to number 2, where we want to spend a lot of time thinking about the design, and a lot of that time is going to be spent on how can we make this closed form, nothing, unbounded with an undeterministic amount of gas expenditure and things like that. So that is, in short, number 5, avoid for loops wherever possible. You should really, really scrutinize every for loop that you see in your smart contracts and ask yourself, is there a way for us to replace this for loop? Is there a better way to do this? Okay, number 6 here is a personal favorite of mine, is to never use parallel data structures. So this also sort of calls back to, hey, let's be very picky about our storage variables, and let's absolutely not have, 2 storage variables that are really used to track the same thing. But specifically, let's never ever duplicate a value across 2 storage variables. So what do I mean by that? What does that look like? To explain this, I actually have a personal story of a way in which this got burned into my mind for probably the rest of time. Is, over probably like 2.5 years ago, I was launching a DeFi protocol of my own. And of course, at this point, I was, a very junior Solidity developer. And at this time, the use of upgradable smart contracts was maybe not as prominent, especially not as prominent as it was today. We didn't have all of the options when it comes to upgradability. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to force a bunch of funds. We wanted to force all the funds out of an old strategy contract so that we could put them into the new strategy contract for our vault and strategy pattern, which is, maybe acceptable. But this, combined with the specific design of the system that we were building that required users to vest out or submit withdrawals for their position in the vault, and then they had to wait a period of like 5 days or something like this to be able to actually collect those funds because of some of the third-party projects that we were integrating with. This meant that we needed to maintain a list of those users who were actually, they were waiting to withdraw from these external parties, because we had to know if we needed to, go ahead and just force bail out their funds and send them directly to them. Now, in hindsight, there is a better way to do this, and I think going back to that DeFi protocol now and rewriting it would be a fun thing to do. But ultimately what we had, kind of ignoring a lot of the details around it that maybe aren't so important, is ultimately what we had was a list of these withdrawals that we needed, or a list of the users who had these early withdrawals. And then we had a mapping to track, from like user to early withdraw struct or something like this. I don't remember exactly what the mapping was, but on that early withdraw struct that was stored in the mapping, we had an index that pointed to where that user was in the list. And so of course, when a user completed their withdrawal, we had to go ahead and remove them from that mapping and from that list. And so we did the classic Solidity move, which is to take the person who's at the last index of that list, move them into whichever index you're trying to overwrite, and then pop from the end of the list. So you just take the last person, you move them there, and then you shrink the list. But of course, what we neglected to do is when you're taking that person at the end of the list and you're moving them in the list, you have to go and you have to update the index of this person in the list because they just moved. And of course, that's something that we did not do. That's something that wasn't uncovered by our testing efforts. It's something that even got past a security review. Now, granted, it's not as obvious as I'm describing it to you now. There's other details involved that make it, maybe something that's not as obvious to uncover, which is why it escaped us as well as the security review that we had gotten at the time. But having to, hop on the call with my co-founder of our then DeFi protocol and figure out how we can basically rescue funds from the vault because nobody could withdraw because of, a state that this vault had gotten into. That has burned into my mind that, hey, whenever you find yourself using parallel data structures, like we were there with the list and the mapping, you want to be extremely careful and you want to really, really reconsider and see if you can't come up with a better design approach, in which case there was definitely a better way to design that. So that is my story on number 6, never use parallel data structures. So let's talk about number 7 here, which is external calls. So we want to pay very close attention to the external calls that we're making in our application. This is, in my experience, the number one area where bugs and vulnerabilities come out is any kind of external calls, any kind of external dependencies. This is where the attacks come out. Specifically, this is where the vulnerabilities come into play. Not even necessarily bugs, but the vulnerabilities. So what are we talking about? What are we looking for when we examine external calls? Well, first of all, of course, we want to look into denial of service. Of course, can this external call, can it expend a ton of gas and make the transaction run out of gas? Can it just revert and then have the transaction revert? And maybe that's, really bad for the system. Can this call, speaking about expending gas, can it commit, some kind of gas griefing, in which case the caller has to expend much more gas than they expected to? Or can it have, some kind of unexpected return data, which either just gives a value to the system that causes some faulty logical error, or could it be a massive amount of return data that results in a return data bomb, which consumes a ridiculous amount of gas, which is another form of gas griefing. Could also be a form of DOS if it makes a transaction run out of gas. And then finally, of course, we have the classic reentrancy. Is there any way that we can reenter into the same function, into a different function on the same contract, into a different contract in the system, into a different system that relies on the state of this system, which is otherwise known as read-only reentrancy? So, needless to say, external calls are the most adversarial lines of code that you will write in your smart contracts. So we want to go through and really scrutinize, really understand the risks of every single external call that we're making. And ideally, if we can, we want to relegate the external calls to their own little sandbox. So that might look like something like a pull over a push or something like this, instead of trying to send tokens to a list of arbitrary addresses. We want to let those arbitrary addresses interact with the function themselves in their own transaction, so they can't do any of these nasty things that come along with an external call. So that is number 7 here. Now let's talk about number 8, which is PostChecks. You might see them referred to as like invariant checks built into the smart contracts themselves. Now, we'll talk about invariant testing and things like this in another video where we discuss, how do you test your smart contracts to have, the greatest security and get to a deployment as swiftly and efficiently as possible, and everything to do with that. But this is talking about specifically, how do we write effective, protective PostChecks and variant checks, whatever you want to call them, in the smart contracts themselves, so that we could potentially even save ourselves from an attack that we didn't even see just by having these checks. So what does this look like? I really like specifically like the way that the GMX v2 system implemented it. Basically, what that looks like is in the GMX v2 system, there is a market token contract. This contract holds a bunch of ERC20 tokens in, like, it's actually got a balance for these ERC20 tokens. But then the way the GMX system works is it splits that balance up amongst several different variables. So there might be like a position impact pool amount. And then there might be like a swap impact pool amount. And then of course you have like the collateral, so like a collateral amount that is stored for positions. And then you might have some funding fee amounts, and the list goes on and on. You could talk about, all the different types of storage variables that they have in their accounting system. But these are all a derivative of what tokens are actually stored in the contract, what the contract actually holds in this balance for these ERC20 tokens. So at the end of every action on the GMX v2 protocol, we actually assert that, hey, if I add up all these things, if I add up the position impact pool, if I add the swap impact pool, if I add the collateral, if I add the funding fee, if I add up all those things that we're tracking in our accounting system, we should check that, hey, this should never get out of line with the balance of tokens that we have in the contract. And so, of course, there's going to be some rounding errors and precision loss. And, maybe that's a side note, like a quick aside on rounding and precision loss, because I think that could actually be another item on this list. But 9 is an odd number, so we cannot bump it up to 10. So we'll just do a quick aside here. When you're rounding and you have to have precision loss in your application, round in favor of you, the protocol, never ever round in the favor of the user. That's where we end up seeing some of these really complex rounding error attacks that use just like the littlest, tiniest rounding error and abuse that to hell and back and end up walking away with millions of dollars. So always round in the favor of the protocol. Do not round in the favor of the user. This is especially important for novel concentrated liquidity protocols, any kind of complex accounting system or anything like that. So with that out of the way, quick aside, done. Let's come back to this. So we don't have complete accuracy, so we're not going to say exactly equals to the balance of. No, we're going to say what we're accounting for should be less than the balance of. So we always have, since we're rounding in favor of the protocol, we're going to leave more of these ERC20 tokens in this contract than go out. And so as a result of that, the summation of all of our individual accounting balances that we have should be less than the actual token balance of our contract. Essentially, we should never be double counting any kind of these variables. And specifically, that's one thing that we found is on early reviews when the GMX team was very early in the development process, there were a few times in which they would double count in very specific scenarios, double count one of these accounting values, which would invalidate this invariant post check. So this is a quick, easy way for them to easily validate that, hey, literally no matter what you do in our system, you can never invalidate this. Otherwise, we'll just revert, right? And the transaction won't go through. So even if you do find a way for this to happen, we could not find a way for that to happen in the 10 months that we spent auditing GMX v2. But even if you did find a way, then it would revert. So having PostChecks as just, a fallback last line of defense is an excellent way to protect your protocol, even when, your normal security process has failed you. So PostChecks are a great thing to have, and they make your invariants very clear to even somebody who's reviewing your code, doing a security review, and makes it very explicit for them. So that as well is a great ancillary benefit. So let's talk about the ninth and final key to developing secure smart contracts that can make it to production efficiently, effectively, ideally as gracefully as possible. And that is, of course, documentation. So everybody's favorite, the security researcher's favorite, I will tell you that. So I think this is one that is probably the least appreciated out of all of these things that I've just listed in terms of how valuable it can be when you are entering, especially that security review phase of the process. Now, a lot of auditors will say, no, I literally don't want to see the documentation. I want to just read the code so that I don't have any of the developer's biases or stuff like this. And there is a little bit of validity to that. But I would say there's much more value to be had to understand, firstly, where the developer is at, what they're thinking, what kind of assumptions they're making, so that you can then, as a security researcher, go and stress test and see if those ideas that they have, if those invariants that they're thinking actually hold. And obviously the documentation helps us to understand the protocol much, much faster. And I will say, as a security researcher, it is really understanding the protocol at a very deep level, which is the biggest bottleneck, the biggest time sink when it comes to doing security research on Web3 projects. So what does this look like? Of course, it looks like having NatSpec. It looks like explaining formulas in the code. This is a huge one, explaining, maybe some lines that are non-obvious, that are maybe not the most readable, interesting decisions that were made, any kind of unique behavior, stuff like that. And then, of course, my favorite that I don't see enough people doing it, but I really, really love this, and I would encourage you to use this in your documentation, is to enumerate the user flow. So how does a user flow through your application? So for example, enumerate all of the jobs to be done of the application. So what is this? Is it a perpetuals protocol? Okay, jobs to be done, probably deposit collateral, open position, close position, liquidate, maybe there's some borrowing fees, stuff like that. So enumerate those features that are to be accomplished, and then walk through how does a user's transaction actually achieve that in the smart contract system. So a fantastic example of this is one that I've seen by the Blueberry finance team here. And we can see, let me just zoom in. We've got, a great overall overview of like, okay, cool. We've got a summary, we've got protocol components, and we've got this really cool component interaction flow section. I really just love this because it's how I like to break systems down and think about them and understand protocols as fast as possible, which is really the key to being a fantastic security researcher. So stuff like this where you walk through, okay, here's how we interact with, we use these functions on this smart contract and we achieve this, really having it just humanized and sort of explained out, walked out like that is extremely helpful. So I really, really encourage more teams to be adding just really simple things like that. It's already in your head. If you can make an artifact of that knowledge, then it will be immediately scalable and translatable to anybody trying to interact with the protocol, anybody trying to do a security review on the protocol, anybody trying to integrate and build on top of your protocol. So there's a huge ROI on doing that. It's a high leverage activity for you to go and do, or to take your development team and implement. So that's something that I would highly recommend, and I would honestly, as a security researcher, request that you do. So those are the 9 things. Here we have all 1 through 9 of them. Now, I hope that these were somewhat useful for you. I hope these were some actionable steps that you can take, some things that you can implement today into your development process. And keep in mind, as you go through and iterate on your smart contracts, maybe design them and ultimately get them to a security review phase, and then hopefully swiftly and efficiently to a deployment. So I wish you the best of luck. Of course, it's not the easiest thing to ship a DeFi protocol, as we know, but I hope that these things can help you on your way. And of course, last but not least, if you are at that stage where you're starting to think about a security review, you want to know a little bit more about what does that process look like, and maybe you want some feedback on, some of your initial designs and the approach that you're taking from somebody who has a specific security mindset, then if that's the case, I would be more than happy to lend my insights. You can see if you qualify for a pre-audit review by clicking the link in the description below. I'm pretty sure there's a link there. We'll see if I put one, but you can go ahead and fill out the form to see if you qualify, and then I'd be happy to give you some feedback and let you know, what is the process going to look like from here in terms of getting your application to deployment. All right, with that out of the way, I look forward to seeing you in the next one.